Welcome to the NGSS Assessment Academy Part 3. Today we're going to talk about diagnostics, formatives, summative assessments for the NGSS. So I was a high school and middle school science teacher in Los Angeles. I taught in downtown LA at an LASD school. I taught in South LA at KIPP, at Green Dot, South LA, and also for a virtual school called Kava. InnerOrbit is a rigorous assessment platform. We write assessments from 6th through 12th grade. Everything centers around performance expectations and phenomena. The site is focused around phenomena. We have hundreds of phenomena now and thousands of assessment items. We're working right now on pre-made diagnostic, formative, and summative assessments. The goal is that you can hop on there and search for a performance expectation, and you'll have an example of a pre-made formative, diagnostic, or summative. You can gather some data before beginning instruction as you're going through a lesson sequence or three-dimensional assessment later on. Everything centers around beautiful and engaging and authentic phenomena. We work very hard to find these for you so that you can have a novel way to assess sense making as you work through the NGSS. We also write custom assessments for our district partners. If you work at a school district, which you probably all do, reach out to me and we'll build diagnostic, formative, or summatives for you and your colleagues to use that align to your specific lessons. We're working through the California state 3 and 4 course model or integrated and domain specific for middle school and high school. But if you are in another state or you have other questions, please chat with us. I'd love to help support you in whatever way I can. The agenda for today, we're going to talk about phenomena, sense making, and clusters. We are going to breeze through that. We spent a lot of time, in fact, 2 whole sessions talking about those things. I strongly recommend you go back, watch part 1 and part 2. If you have any questions about that, they provide the basis for everything we're doing right now. Then we'll talk about elements and the performance expectations. We're going to talk a little bit about isolating DCIs for diagnostics, give some example diagnostic assessments, and then we'll talk about elements and evidence statements for formative clusters, and then we'll get into clusters for summative assessment. So first, what's a good phenomena? Students must engage in sense making. If your students are not engaging in sense making, then this is not a 3-dimensional assessment. Some attributes of this, and again, we have a whole part on this, are it should be specific, novel, compelling, complex. Watch part 1 for more info. We have examples of good phenomena and of poor phenomena. They need to be complex enough that students are having to make sense of what's going on, apply what they've learned. There should be no regurgitation. It should be novel, should be something they haven't seen before, but can be investigated with everything they've learned in the unit. We recommend using clusters of questions as well. So groups of questions are centered around a phenomena. This is what a cluster is. I recommend you use 2 to 10 questions. I recommend you use the evidence statements and elements to write groups of questions to scaffold up to sense making. I think the evidence statements do a phenomenal job of building from basic knowledge that students should have all the way up to where students need to be to meet the performance expectation. We look at the evidence statements a lot, and our reports also reflect what elements have been covered in the evidence statements. Please watch part 2 for more info. We have a whole 30-minute session on this. So first, we're going to talk about elements and DCIs for diagnosis. In the appendices for the NGSS, the K-12 progressions are incredibly helpful. They go over DCIs building from K through 12. We recommend that in the very beginning of a unit, of a lesson, whatever it is, that you write a few questions that access background knowledge. What gaps in understanding do you anticipate from prior grade bands? If you've taught this content before, students are going to struggle with certain elements from either middle school or elementary school or whatever it is that they should have when they enter into your high school biology or chemistry classroom. This is a part of the progression. So this is PS1A, which is structure and properties of matter. There is a progression from grades 3 through 12. This is the appendices. This is a screenshot of the appendices for the NGSS. There's things that students should learn in 3.5 and 6.8 and 9.12. And all of these are reflected in the performance expectations that are associated with each of these grade level bands. If you haven't been there before, San Diego County has a spectacular website that goes really in depth and has everything is linked together, which is beautiful. So you can look at, for PS1A, what performance expectations did students need to cover in 3.5? What should they cover in 6.8? And then what should they cover in 9.12? You can click on each of those, click back. It's a beautiful thing. But going a little bit deeper than the progressions in the K-12, in the NGSS appendices, are the elements. So within each performance expectation, there's a level of detail, a little bit more granular, which are these elements. So we're looking at right now PS1A, the DCI disciplinary core idea for a 5th grade PS1-3, and it's that measurements of a variety of properties can be used to identify materials. So within the K-12 progressions, it shows what students should learn in 3, 5, 6, 8, 9, 12, and then deeper and more granular, there are these elements within each performance expectation. So within PS1A in 5th grade, before we assess it at the middle school level, there are going to be elements that students should have learned for PS1A. So students should know that matter can be subdivided, and it still exists even if we can't detect it. They should know that the weight of matter is conserved even when it vanishes. They should know that measurements can be used to identify things, and different substances have different properties, essentially. This goes a level deeper than the K-12 progressions. These are elements within each of these different performance expectations in 5th grade. So in our reports for InnerOrbit, we outline all of the elements for every single DCI, and we report on them because we write questions specifically aligned to 3rd through 5th grade standards, 6th through 8th grade elements, and then 9th through 12th grade elements. So as you go into our site and you look at a diagnostic, you'll see questions specifically aligned to the grade level band below where your students are at, because we should assess that first. And then, questions that are aligned to the grade level band that the cluster is written for. So like a high school grade level. Cool. So let's talk about isolating those DCIs in an actual diagnostic. So we're going to start with a phenomenon. How is paper made is the phenomena that we've chosen for this. We have all these beautiful images and description of how paper is made. It's fantastic. You can go check this out on our site. We're not going to go too deeply into that. Right now, we're going to work on a diagnostic for MSPS1-3. And for MSPS1-3, students need to gather and make sense of information to describe that synthetic materials come from natural resources and impact society. This is a pretty complex performance expectation in the scope of things. There are a lot of elements that students need to learn before they can be successful with this. In particular, this involves the SEP of obtaining and evaluating information. So students will inevitably have to read, look at charts, graphs. There are a lot of other skills that students need before they can access this. I would just like to make a little side note here that, when you're looking at an SEP, something like obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information, or if it's for, classroom management, finding non-curricular ways for students to use an SEP is excellent. If we're talking about bias, we can talk about some argument 2 of your students had and what bias each of those students has in the argument, and look at the differences in opinion there. And identifying bias is right now it's a pretty big deal. I would say that before you get into a performance expectation, you can look at the DCIs, as we're going to talk about here. But when you're looking at SEPs, I recommend using non-curricular activities. Like it could be a news article, it could be just some silly thing. Evaluate how well students understand or can obtain, evaluate, and communicate information. So for MSPS1-3, before students enter into a middle school level performance expectation, they need to get at the 5th grade standards. There's two DCIs in MSPS1-3. So as I said before, this is an especially complex PE. So it's PS1A, structure and property of matters, and then PS1B, chemical reactions. These are the elements from 5th grade that scaffold up and lead up into the middle school performance expectation. So students need to know that matter has changed even when it appears to vanish, that matter is not ever destroyed or created. And also that when substances are mixed, something with new properties is often formed or can be formed. So we write some specific questions around this. So for this 5th grade PS1A, We have, if 100 pounds of wood are put in and only 80 pounds of paper are made, what probably happened to the rest of the wood? Do you understand that matter is not created or destroyed in this process, that it just changes? For PS1B, we have a couple questions. When two things are mixed together in a chemical reaction, they will probably have the same properties or different properties. And then based on the information here, does the paper we use have the same properties as the wood it comes from? Because paper often goes through chemical processes to become, what we use now. It's not the same, and it will have different properties. So these are questions. Again, we're looking at the 5th grade level DCIs to diagnose what students should have learned before they're walking in. And if students don't understand these elements, that chemical reactions lead to different properties and that matter can't just disappear, it'll be tough for them to access some of the elements in middle school and what they have to do with those performance expectations. That's a diagnostic. Easy, right? Again, we write all of these for every performance expectation on our site, and I'd love to share that with you. If you want, you can scroll through the chat and find the calendar link, set up a time to meet with me. I'd love to chat and show you around. I hope I can be helpful, support you. So now let's talk about formative evidence statements. Asked earlier, what role do you see evidence statements playing in assessment creation? So the evidence statements, I think, do an excellent job of scaffolding up and getting up to the performance expectation. So before you hit them with a crazy sense-making 3-dimensional CER statement, maybe give them a couple of questions to walk them up to that, because we've honestly found that most of the students that are taking assessments on our site, or just from other teachers that come in, high school level performance expectations are very challenging. And students have only gone through the NGSS for a couple of years, truly implemented with fidelity, then they're going to have trouble with this. It's a huge paradigm shift. So I recommend using the evidence statements to sort of scaffold up to that. For MSPS 1.3, this is a screenshot of the evidence statements, and all these little pink arrows identify specific elements that we're going to go over in our formative assessment. So typically the beginning of the evidence statements has some background knowledge and basic information that students should know going into this. So in order to approach all of this, they need to know these things. And then the last parts of the evidence statements get into the really complex, making connections between things. And for this one, it's evaluating information or drawing models, writing CER statements, and really synthesizing a lot of information. We break down these evidence statements and identify, all right, so in the beginning, you need to know that paper is natural, goes through chemical processes, and thus becomes synthetic. And there are effects that this has in society. Later on, students need to know how they're formed, what chemical processes they go through. So we have some questions on that. Later on, how do the physical and chemical properties contribute to the function of the material? So now we have questions on how the finishing and cutting of paper contributes to its function. And then at the end of this cluster of questions, we have some free response questions. So note that everything before this were all multiple choice questions, drag and drop. At the end, now we get into really complex questions, like how the synthetic material satisfies a societal need or desire through the properties of its structure and function. That is a really complex question. So now we have some free response questions where we actually ask students to really dive in deep and explain what's going on. Follow up after a formative. So this is really important, and it's something that we have to talk about a lot. Formative assessments are not summative assessments. This isn't generating a grade. This is not a test. We don't just walk away after a formative assessment or a diagnostic, hopefully, either. After you give this, you should review. You should do a think aloud. You should correct misunderstandings. These questions are very rigorous. Making sense of phenomena is really, really tough. You should walk your students through it. This is why you should have one phenomena for formative assessment and then one phenomena for summative assessment, in addition to your phenomena that you're using for instruction. So strongly, strongly recommend that you go over these and you use those formative assessments and you show student responses and you talk about and even have students share what they did. Formative assessments identify gaps in teaching. I realize that there are elements that students misunderstood, but really that's on you as a teacher. If your students are struggling with elements in your formative assessments, you need to adjust your instruction and provide new learning experiences in order to, to make sure that they can access this material. You can also reassess. I love giving the same questions again or having students revise their previous answers. So you can create a second assessment with the same questions in it, have students make revisions, have students, re-answer the questions, and then talk about the differences and why they approach the question differently as well. Now let's talk about summative assessments. So this is all about clusters, and our last session was all about clusters, and I'd love to chat with you more about this, but I recommend you go watch part 2 and then maybe even check out part 1, because we spent a lot of time thinking about how to write groups of questions to assess this. So for a summative assessment, you need a rich phenomena for sense making. I would recommend you have a novel phenomena to avoid regurgitation. If your students have seen something before, they're not making sense of it. They're just telling you what you told them to say or what they heard other students say, whatever it is. So I strongly recommend that. So our making paper, or how is paper made, was the first assessment we used for all the formatives. And then how glass is made and the chemical and physical processes that, that glass goes through and batch and all of this is a second thing that we're using for summative assessment. So another phenomena in there. So I recommend at the beginning adding a few diagnostic, background, DCI questions, the same principles that we used in the initial diagnostic questions, use those again for the summative assessment. Then write 3-dimensional questions written with performance expectations and evidence statements. I recommend 2 types of questions using rigorous multiple choice and free response questions. The rigorous multiple choice questions we're going to talk about a little bit more, but adding in both those allows you to gather a little bit more data, and it's pretty helpful. So the reality is that the rigorous multiple choice questions are most closely aligned to state tests. If you're worried about your students taking the CAST or the MISA or whatever state you're in and the test that they're going to work on, you need to write some really, really high quality multiple choice questions to best simulate what they're going to be going through. One question stem that we love that I think is highly appropriate, and in a lot of the example tests, they have questions like this. So one of your classmates makes the following statement. One of your classmates draws a diagram like this, and then provide some, feasible responses, and then use common misunderstandings as distractors bonus points if you use misunderstandings that your students had in all your formative assessments. So tying everything together, making connections between those is really, really helpful and important. In addition, multiple choice just allows for easier grading, and it ensures an attempt. I'm sure you have found in your own classrooms or in your districts that as students progress through multiple choice questions and then they hit a modeling question or a CER statement, that they're going to answer the multiple choice questions, and there may not be 100% answers for the free response questions because they're much more rigorous. They're very, very challenging. And, if you have a couple rigorous multiple choice questions and then a CER statement later on, then it allows you to likely get more answers out of students and collect more data. So super helpful. So something that, and this comes up all the time. So as far as true NGSS alignment, a free response question, students drawing their own model, that's what the NGSS is all about. What scientists actually do, writing a report based on evidence that they collected and data, making their own claims. This is true alignment. However, it goes beyond what most state tests will require. So in your classroom, as you build towards those state tests, you can include, like the CERs and the actual diagrams. I mean, we have a lot of that on our site. We see a lot of teachers building those assessments as well, but they go a little bit beyond what most state tests. And there may be some free response questions in state tests. However, for the most part, it's multiple choice because, they can't grade 50 free response questions for kid, and your kids won't sit through that. That's it. You're awesome. I'm so glad that we were able to do this and you're able to be here. I had a lot of fun because I geek out on this stuff. So if you want to chat with me in the future, I'd love to talk, but otherwise have a beautiful rest of your day. Please stay safe and stay healthy. Just want to make sure that that, yeah, that we all just care for each other right now, because, yeah, it's crazy times.